Welcome to Discourse Politics, everybody. Today we're going to talk about a discussion that happened between Jim Lee of Susquehanna Polling and Dr. Christopher Borick of Muhlenberg College Institute of Public Opinion. And what this debate about is sort of the future of polling and why 2020 polls are probably wrong. Again, in my opinion, I side with the person who's basically saying 2020 polls are wrong. And we'll get into the methodology of how people poll and sort of the problems that it produces in modeling. Namely that for some reason you can't get Trump voters on the phone. But nonetheless, we're going to step through this debate and we're going to basically talk it out and we'll listen to what they have to say.
I'm thinking this is going to be a factual show, which it is, but I get the sense that, I don't want to say you have an agenda, but you're mad about something.
Yeah, I am. I'm mad because polls that come out days before an election that are egregiously off. And I don't mean by a couple points, because Chris is right.
Do they affect the vote? Do they affect the vote?
And I have to pause here for just a second. I can't stand the moderator who's moderating this discussion between two pollsters. I can't stand his tone here because if the polling error is that bad, even if it didn't affect the vote, isn't the question, why is the polling error that bad? It may or may not affect the vote. It does have consequences money-wise. And the consequences are that when your candidate is behind by 10 or 11 points, you do not. Nobody donates to that candidate. You can watch donation historical records, and the moment somebody slips outside 5, 6, 7%, their donations dry up. So if polling is that far off, it's actually an issue for money more so than voter suppression, in my opinion. But that's just my opinion. Anyway, let's hear his response.
The margin of error, well, I guess we'll never know the answer to that because clearly in 2016, voters weren't looking too much at the polls. But when a poll comes out that has one candidate, in this case Hillary Clinton, winning by 11 points when the winner of the race is the other candidate, that's not an outlier. That is bad polling, and it makes our entire industry look bad.
Okay.
So I've called on the American Association of Public Opinion Research,
AKA APOR. Shameless plug for my other video where we went over APOR research for the 2016 election. The title of that video is Are Polls Accurate? It's a longer video, but it's summing up that whole study that APOR did and then applying it to 2020, which they're still making the same mistake in 2020 that they are in 2016. But nonetheless, that's that video, and let's focus on this one.
to crack down on egregious polling, to tighten standards for firms like F&M that clearly don't understand the landscape of Pennsylvania, and that guys like Chris and I that are trying to do quality work. Chris's last poll in 2016, within the margin of error, ours showed the race between Clinton and Trump a statistical tie. When others like F&M had the race at 11 points, and you don't think that's voter suppression?
Gotcha.
So I'm sticking up for the industry here by saying we need to crack down, and someone needs to stand up and say, you know what, this is getting out of control.
So here's where the video starts getting interesting. They are getting into the meat and potatoes of, is there a bias in polling? And what is the methodologies of polling? So here we go.
I never sense that you have an agenda. Is that hard to do, by the way? I mean, you've got to be very neutral to make these numbers clear and accurate.
Yeah, you want to. I mean, I always say this to people that when I get attacked from the left or the right, I'm going to put a number out, and you're going to see on election day how it performs. Historically, if you look at our poll results, we actually have a slight Republican lean in our results. Not because I'm Republican or Democrat, it just happens to be how we polled. You have to be transparent. You have to show how you do it, how you proceed, and then people will attack you for almost anything they want.
So a lot of the pro-Trump crowd, I think, is saying, don't forget, there's 6 or 7, 10 points in there. We got this thing, kind of thing. I mean, I don't sense that. There is some nervousness, obviously. You think that's not there?
I would, if I was a supporter of the president, and I was banking on, if the numbers they could move closer, like they did in 2016, and that's a different story. You get the averages are a couple points.
And that's one of the excuses from the APOR study back in 2016 on why the 2016 elections were wrong. They believe that late breakers threw off the polls. They don't believe they captured that in the polls. I believe they did capture that in the polls simply because when you look at the total, polls tightened very much at the end, which means that late breakers were captured. So they said that they basically are trying to double dip in their error. They said that 2 or 3 points of error in swing states was solely based upon late breaking votes. They captured those in their polling. So the fact that they corrected their polling by 2 or 3 points at the very end by late breakers doesn't mean that they also get to claim that 2 or 3 points of the 5.1% that they were off in 2016, they get to claim that again and say, well, that's a good portion of that 5.1%, because it's not. They can't claim it twice. They captured it in the polling, and you might see that same thing again. They were still 5.1% off. They were still 5.1% off even after the polls tightened in swing states.
Are you surprised, by the way, I'm sorry, real quick, how many points can move in a day or two in an election, or not really?
Well, yeah, not really if there's big movements. But the last thing I'll say is they haven't moved as much as we might give them credit for this fall. They move, but...
Look at that face. That's the face of a man who's about to say, hey, remember 2016? Remember that election 4 years ago where everybody thought, no, there's no chance. There's no chance that they're that far off, that they're 5.1% off for Donald Trump to win. That's the look of a face of a man who's about to put the dude in his place.
Yeah.
Not always as much as we think gigantic.
So you're saying, I haven't maybe asked it properly, the numbers are the numbers, and if you're thinking there's 7-10 points in there, I think you're dreaming.
I would say that's a big reach.
Your thoughts on that?
I disagree with Chris respectfully. The polls aren't moving. We had the race in Pennsylvania 2 points in our September poll. Now we see other firms coming out with polls where the margin of error, the race is tied. Mm-hmm. It's been tied all along in our estimation.
Boom, there it is. So what this guy just said, and we'll get into it in a second, is basically that my polling methodology and my polling model has had this as a tight race, just like his polling methodology and his polling model had it tight back in 2016. And for people to say, oh, well, the race is tightening now, it's suspect. It's always been suspect to me that they do that. And what he's basically saying is other pollsters are finally catching up to where he's been since September, that the race in Pennsylvania has been plus minus 2, 3, 4 points. It's never been 10. It's never been 11. It wasn't in 2016, and it isn't now. So we will get into the differences of methodologies of acquiring the data and then modeling differences. And that is the crux of the matter. But I need to continue to lay the foundation, so we're going to continue watching this for just a little bit longer.
Or do you think that 5 or 6 points that you hear about that people say are out there are for real? I want to make that point because I hear it all the time. And there's 5 or 6 points. The Trumpers are not going to tell people when they call.
Yeah, well, keep in mind, the president is out there with the narrative that we shouldn't trust polling. So I think, and quite frankly, many people call him everything from a misogynist to a racist to, everything in between. So there are a lot of voters out there that don't want to admit to a live telephone agent they're voting for a guy that's been called a racist.
So now he's starting to bring up the topic of social desirability bias, that this president has been called a lot of things, and whether they're true or not, I don't want to make a value judgment on whether they're true or not. What I do want to say is, if you are thinking about voting for the president, you're less likely to admit it to somebody on a phone call that you don't even know, because you don't want to be labeled as the things that the president has been labeled. There is a high probability that you are suffering from social desirability bias, and that studies have indicated that 10% of Republicans refuse to answer polls and admit that they're voting for Donald Trump. It is as high as 10% that Republicans will tell a pollster that they're not going to vote for Donald Trump, even though they are. That's as high as that number has been measured. 10% say, yeah, I'm voting for Biden, when in reality, they're actually going to vote for Donald Trump.
So that submerged Trump factor is very real. And we've been able to capture it. And I'm really disappointed others in our industry have not. In 2016, our polling in the summer and early fall showed Pennsylvania was up for grabs. Other firms are putting out leads for Hillary Clinton in double digits, and that was never the case, in my opinion.
Gotcha.
And we're seeing it happen again now.
All right, good point. Chris Moore, what is a good poll for those viewers who, they're not savvy in terms of your field? How many people, and how do you make a good poll?
Sure, it's a whole bunch of factors. One is you have to have a decent sample size, but sample size isn't everything. You could have a gigantic sample that's chosen poorly,
good point,
and it'll do a bad job. You could have a smaller sample.
So it's a quality of sample, not quantity, I guess you could say.
Exactly. Look at the wording. You want to see how questions are worded. There's order effects. You could put one question in front of another and it'll have an impact. So always be transparent with your documents. Talk about your weighting, what you wait for, what you don't wait for in the survey. Show that. Share your data. We'll give actually our data to people that, we'll hold it for a while, but you want to be able to see and feel these things.
So now we're starting to shape what this battle is about. In modern day polling, there are basically 2 things we need to focus on. The first thing is polling methodology. By what method is the data gathered? By and large, you have calling. One of the things that you have to do with calling is not just landline, but also cell phone lines. And then you have online polling. You even have some that are even testing email polling. So the methodology basically is how you collect data with phone and cell phone being the primary traditional way of doing it. And then you have online email as a newer method to gather data. But more and more, a lot of pollsters are leaning towards that. And we'll get to the reason why here in a second, why newer pollsters or pollsters who are looking at the data differently than traditional methods, why they're starting to use more online technology and email.
To what Jim said, is it all telephone? I mean, I hate to be naive about this.
It's very diverse within the field right now. A lot of pollsters, we continue to do primarily telephone for election surveys.
Okay.
Others have gone to online panels, some that are recruited via telephone and web. It's a diversity of methods.
What do you think is the best cross-section for a legitimate poll?
Well, any poll that tries to minimize and marginalize non-response error by giving people numerous opportunities to complete the survey,
Gotcha.
i.e. through telephone, through internet, through texting, is going to provide those safeguards to really reduce that margin of error and make it more realistic. Because with any kind of survey technique, there is bias in every technique. There are certain people you just don't reach when you do telephone polling. There's certain you don't reach when you do internet polling.
So again, another shameless plug for my video, Are Polls Accurate? What he just said there is important. Traditional calling methods are starting to yield something like a 5% response rate or less. And you cannot make a accurate predictive model based upon a non-response error of 95%. What Jim Lee is talking about is basically that you have to give people multiple opportunities to respond. Now, why is this important, and why his polls are typically tighter than polls that don't do what he's doing? Here's why. There are two sort of thoughts as to why Trump voters are not responding to pollsters. Number one, there is a social desirability bias against saying you're going to vote for Donald Trump. Number two, typically, and this is one of those things, the further right you go, the more likely you are to be more of a private individual, to be suspect of a stranger calling you. You're more likely to believe, it's nobody's business to be responding to you. You don't want to be recorded. You don't want to be anyone to sort of have a record of how you possibly vote. You're just less open to the idea of giving out information to other people. What this person is saying is that by his polling method, and Trafalgar does something very similar, they give people multiple opportunities to be able to answer the poll. So that way, instead of getting a non-response bias of 19 out of 20 people who just are not going to answer your poll, you get much more response. And that will give you a better distribution of who is out there and where they lean and in which direction. And when he does that, he's able to capture a little bit more of that shy Trump voter who might, I'm not going to talk to somebody on the phone about it. And then maybe they receive a text message or an email that says, hey, this is private. We don't aggregate data, personal data. It will never be tied directly to you. We just want to know how many people are with the president and how many people are with Joe Biden. And that's all we want to know. They might get a higher response rate. And that response rate is different than traditional polling methods. And when that difference occurs, traditional pollsters freak out. Because by and large, when you do that, you get a response bias that's higher for Republicans than liberals. So, for example, when you do traditional polling methods, it's not uncommon to get a plus 12 Democrat sample. And the reason is because polls are filtered using traditional polling methods, and then you have to pass what's called gating material. The gating material might be if you haven't voted in the last two elections, even if you say you're going to vote, we throw you out because you're an infrequent voter. There other gating materials might be, the way you answer questions doesn't match up. Are you registered to vote? You say no, but have you voted in the past? Yes. That would immediately throw you out of the poll. There's all kinds of gating material that keeps people from getting into the poll. When you do that kind of method, your response rate typically is plus 10, plus 12 Democrat. When you do the newer methodology, where you give people multiple chances to answer, where you swear that their information is secret, that you're not sharing their personal information with anybody, and that all you want to know is what percentage of the population supports Donald Trump, you get a different response rate. And that is what Susquehanna polls is, which is who Jim represents, is his polling research is Susquehanna. And they have had accurate polling in the Rust Belt, along with Trafalgar. I know people make fun of Trafalgar, and You can make fun of them all you want, but they are using newer methods of polling. And those newer methods of polling, the traditionalists like Nate Silver do not like the new standards of polling. It produces some weird results, like Trafalgar had, based upon the response rate, probably using text, email, and online. He had a response rate where something like 40% of the youth vote from 18 to 29 said they were supporting Donald Trump. That is unfathomable. It produces a different group of data with which you can work with to model. So the old model, from looking at it, is producing a +6, +9, +10, +12 Democrat lean. And the newer model is producing a +3, +4 Republican lean. So maybe there's something to this. And in that APOR study we went over in my video on Are Polls Accurate, they basically gave props to Trafalgar for doing something along this line with their methodology, that they're asking different types of questions and different ways of asking the question and allowing people the opportunity to respond to capture some of those shy Trump voters that may or may not exist. Nobody really knows for certain.
So your thoughts, and I'm going to go over to Chris. Where are we now? Where are we, Pennsylvania, which is hugely important?
Sure is.
And where are we in terms of the election as you see it?
I think it's going to be a very close race. I don't see this being a blue wave. I don't think Biden wins in a lot of the battleground states Trump carried in 2016. We have the race in Pennsylvania tied. Our poll the first week of September showed a 2-point race. Others showed a double-digit lead for Biden. Now we're seeing other firms showing it tighten, when, in my opinion, it's been tied all along. So I think Pennsylvania is clearly a battleground for both candidates, and I think the election is going to be decided by a very, very small electoral vote outcome.
Who do you think wins?
I can't call it. If the turnout is what I think it's going to be, I think Trump wins it.
Gotcha. Chris?
So one thing I want to point out is that it could be that Donald Trump is so divisive and that that social undesirability bias is so high that it broke traditional polling methods and they'll be fine in the future. I doubt that's the case. The reason I doubt that is because the video I did on Are Polls Accurate and this video and all the other stuff that I've looked at, the non-response rate of getting to where it is as high as 95% for some polls, they have to find a different way to poll people because they're not getting the right mix of demographics and the right mix of people who say they're going to vote for a certain candidate. Just an example, if you have the working class going for Joe Biden at a rate of, say, 45% to Donald Trump's, 55% or something, right? If you amplify that number in your modeling, it may not be correct, especially if the working class in, say, Wisconsin is going to go 65% for Donald Trump and only, 35% for Biden. In fact, as your poll weights education, by class or by education, the worse your poll would actually get. And I think that's what we're seeing here is people are saying, well, Donald Trump lost 15% support among non-college educated working class. Baloney. I mean, maybe he has, but the problem is they're getting those kind of response rates from their polling methodology. And then inside their modeling, and this is the important part, they're taking those numbers and they're amplifying them by saying, well, we expect the non-educated white working class vote to come out in this percentage. And it was a higher percentage in 2016, so we're going to keep that high percentage in 2020. But Donald Trump lost 15% support in that group. And I'm just making up numbers, but I'm doing it to demonstrate that as you model that, you actually amplify the error if you're getting a non-response bias that does not allow you to get a proper makeup of the people that you're trying to poll. And this is the fundamental problem with polling. They cannot get Donald Trump supporters on the phone, and therefore their polling will never be accurate. You have to find ways to get those voters on the phone. Trafalgar has done it. Susquehanna has done it. Now, does that mean that their polling method is correct? Not necessarily. They could be +3 and Donald Trump still loses this election by 1 or 2 points. They could be completely off, and polling is actually correct this time. Nobody really knows. But the problem is we need to ask the question, are we repeating the same mistake in 2020 as we made in 2016? And I have to give a resounding yes. It appears we are making the same exact mistake we made in 2016, and 2020 is going to either be a very close election or Donald Trump is going to win. I'm going to put together some sort of way to measure, and I will put out a predictive model of what I think Donald Trump is going to do in this election, how many electoral votes I think he's going to get, and whether or not I think he's going to win the election. So I'm working on a prediction video, and that should be out most likely tomorrow or maybe even late tonight, but most likely tomorrow. Make sure you share this video far and wide. Make sure you like and subscribe for more social and political commentary, and I will see you next video.